pull something out because I want to get to that topic too, because we talked about outcome measures and you pulled one out, which I think confuses people to no end, and it's range of motion. Okay. So I'm going to throw these questions at you, and I want you to just give me so number one, if you take a bird's eye view of the literature with regards to range of motion,
Yeah.
is it an effective outcome measure when it comes to pain or injury prevention?
Yes.
Go.
So again, I'll take you on a little journey of how we got to trying to think of range of motion, and I'll kind of take you on where I think we are right now, because I know you and I have talked about this as well. So again, I'll take you back to school days.
Yes.
Remember in school
Take
days,
me back to school, Mikey.
when we were in Cairo school, range of motion was
All this was black, by the way, back then. I'm just noticing that.
I couldn't even grow this back then.
Hold on.
Range of motion was one of those things that you did. Oh, am I good now?
Yeah, you're good now.
So range of motion was just one of those things that you did as part of your orthopedic examination, right? And so I remember in Cairo school, remember we had to memorize, or at least I did, because I'm like that. I memorized every single range of motion of every single joint in the body so that I could understand how to do it on an orthopedic exam. Mm-hmm. And, we were taught active range of motion, we were taught passive range of motion, but I really didn't understand range of motion. And that's not how you understand range of motion. It's not a thing that, comes included with your shoulder. It's not a thing that, comes included with, all these other joints. And so I think over the years, what we've done is we've tried to tease out what range of motion actually is. And so range of motion actually is, two different things. So again, getting back to the school days in Cairo school, we always did active range of motion first, and then you push that thing a little bit more, and that somehow delineated your passive range of motion. Mm-hmm. And we know that you could push somebody passively more than they could move actively. And so when you really start to tease that out, that means that range of motion is inherently two different qualities. So it's made up of two different things. So it's made up of some passive qualities and it's made up of some active qualities. And I think that's the first thing that we should probably try to tease out with respect to range of motion, is that there are some passive properties that will influence range of motion that are necessary within tissues. And there are some active qualities that are necessary to have working to achieve active range of motion. So we've teased all that out. That really just means that your passive range of motion, you'll have some neurological things. So you'll have some muscle neurological stuff, which is really just sarcomere overlap. And you'll have some bioflow stuff, which in our system is just the continuity of connective tissue or white stuff that's involved. And so, as you move something from short to long, those two things are in play when we move in passive range of motion, which is really just taking something from a shortened position to a lengthened position. And so really what that is that means that something that's moved from short to long, we know that it will increase in tension. And so the tension comes from these active components and these passive components. And that's really just, a basic understanding of what we call length tension, or the length tension relationship. So if you really tease that out, that means that passive range of motion is an investigation in normal length tension relationships. Because again, we talk about this in FR. We use it as a drill, as a matter of fact, that if you take something if I take my arm like this, there'll be no tension in my bicep. And as I lengthen it out, there will be tension in my bicep. And that's just a normal relationship. And it's the relationship that passive range of motion displays. And within that, you have the force length curve, which is the length curve of a sarcomere. And that's part of the active component of range of motion. So now you can tease the active component away from the passive component. So there's these two things, passive properties and active properties, that overlap into what we generally just call range of motion. And
Pause.
so most people
So
are here.
if I just to define for the people who are not in our profession, so we can say the active qualities are the ones being influenced by neurological activity,
That's right.
and then passive components is just the physical,
The physical stretching of the
stretching
tissues.
of stuff. Continue.
Yes. So most people just look at those as being one thing. And what we've tried to do is we've tried to tease them out and say, well, those give us two indications of, let's say, system properties with respect to range of motion. And so when you start to qualify that there are these two things, it helps you understand why range of motion might be an important quality that people have. And oftentimes I talk about range of motion as being a base rate. And so when we talk about base rates are things that have to be there for other things to happen. They're like you talk a lot about prerequisites. It's the same thing. We're just coming from two different frameworks there. And so range of motion is the base rate for movement. And so now we can say that there is a passive base rate that we should have, and there's an active base rate that we should have. And we've sort of gone into the literature on that stuff and tried to tease those out. And we know now that, as we learned in chiro school, just nobody taught us this, is that passive is bigger than active to a certain extent. And so that means that if we're looking at passive range of motion as being bigger and less active than active range of motion, it should be the first base rate that we look at. And so we've sort of gone in, I won't get into the nitty gritty of all that, but that's kind of what we look at in our system as being sort of that first base rate. And we equate that not to a number, as most people will do. We equate that to a system demand, because that's really important, because there's a lot of things that you have to then, qualify for yourself in terms of the demand of what that passive range of motion should be. And that's the person that's kind of sitting in front of you, that you're looking at, and what activities they do, and what demands do they have, and how stressed out are they. And
so in other words, I want to jump in again. So in other words, when someone asks you how much range of motion do you need, that's a very common question. And
yeah,
we're often accused of creating contortionists for some reason.
Yep.
I think only because we work with contortionists and dancers and gymnasts that people think that that's always our goal. But we've said from the beginning that you only need as much range of motion as your system demands you need, plus
Correct.
a buffer, right? So what you were saying, just to rephrase, is that, we're not looking for 120 degrees because that's normal. We're looking for 120 degrees because that's what you use for your body. And we're defining normal as being what it is that you want to do with your body. Because we've said before, you can define joints as normal by taking the average of 100 humans and say ankle range of motion in these 100 humans was this. But what you're doing is taking the shitty average of probably a lot of shitty ankles, right?
That's right.
You can't tell me that the ankle range of motion is normal at this, it's abnormal at that, because if you give me an Olympic lifter, I got to make that ankle abnormal just to function normally in the context of lifting. So
that's right.
Yep.
So that gets us into those two terms, which is, what is the prerequisite for the demand, or what is the base rate for the demand? And the passive range of motion has to be that plus a buffer, as you said, just because, we'll get into that in a second, why we need that buffer.
Okay.
And then we look at an active range of motion, which is how much. So if you can be lengthened to a position, therefore you've defined what we would say would be normal length tension properties for that prerequisite or that base rate. Then we want to look at, can you move yourself into that base rate as a foundational capacity that you should be able to have. And that allows us to then define an active range of motion, which is then, can you control your movement into what your demand is? And we come up with a ratio A lot of people, sort of question our ratio, but our ratio is based on some evidence. And so we try to look for a 1-to-1 ratio of passive to active. Just means that you can be moved and you can move yourself.
Yeah, the goal, you should try to control the ranges that you have, right?
Of course.
And
Yes.
the goal should be to control all of them, but we understand that the passive range will always exceed the active range.
That's right.
So, not to get into the nitty-gritty of FRA, but what we're saying is that because the law of specificity states that strength attained at one angle can only be utilized plus or minus approximately 20 degrees from that spot, what we say is that we can expect to control up to 85% of a passive range of motion. That doesn't mean we don't want more, and it doesn't mean sometimes you only get 80% of it, but the goal is control as much range of motion as you have.
Exactly.
Okay.
So now we're gonna, and hopefully that's clear for everybody, but now we're gonna try to make it a little bit more, hopefully not more difficult, but maybe a little bit more about how we then view things a little bit differently with respect to range of motion. And so, well, I guess I should stop and say then, with respect to injury then, because you asked me, is range of motion and is it a good outcome for injury?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it is when you take these things into consideration.
It was a bad question, because what I was getting at was, generally, if you look at the research, if someone is more, okay, the old saying, that which does not bend breaks.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And that was the predominant thing that was that's what sports medicine was focusing on for injury prevention, right? Make people more long and better. So what I was saying is, does passive range of motion in and of itself equate to a reduction in injury rates? Or is it a smart idea for, let's say, a therapist, a massage therapist, to say, oh, your shoulder hurts, let me check the range of motion, and then when the range of motion passively gets better, you're going to feel better? Does that have relevance?
No. No.
Okay. Yes.
And then to take that a step further is if someone comes in with shoulder pain and they check their range of motion and now the pain is gone, but the range of motion didn't change, that is also not good, which is why range of motion in that, and that's what I was just going to say, when we can tease it out as we just teased it, range of motion then starts to make a little bit more sense. And then you could see two things. You can see that how inherently poor it's used in research as an outcome measure, but then how valuable it potentially is as an outcome measure when you understand it more.
Okay.
Because if I'm looking at someone as an individual system and they don't have range of motion to meet their demand from either of those two base rates, well, then, bells have to be going off and saying, well, there's a problem that's here. And we don't know that problem is going to be injury per se. But we know that system behavior is not meeting system demand. And that is a problem. But to take that a step further, to try to tease this out a little bit more, and I know we've had a few discussions on this, one of the concepts that I think is a valuable concept that we've introduced we introduced it in FR first, but we talked about it at the summit, and I want to say that it went over a lot of people's heads just because I don't know that we made it important enough, was that movement doesn't happen in ranges of motion per se, right? Movement happens in what we've termed movement zones. And so this gets us into a discussion about what those movement zones are and what they're made up of and how that becomes important as a outcome for potential injury reduction, which you're not going to find. Nobody's going to be able to go in the literature and find this because this is something that we've rationalized, reading the stuff that we're reading that is non-manual therapy or non-strength and conditioning research. And so let's talk about that for a second. So what we've said up to this point is we've said, let's take the shoulder, for example. We've said that the shoulder is made up of 6 ranges of motion, flexion, extension, AB, AD, IR, ER. And we've understood them from a very basic range of motion concept, and we've understood them as being 6 differentiated movements. And what we've said is that that's not really the case, that, to be quite honest, you can't really define flexion per se, other than we know that that's movement up here. But, there's a whole variety of angles of what we could consider flexion.
Mhm.
And so we've considered those varieties of angles of flexion as being the flexion movement zone. And the flexion movement zone will bleed into the abduction movement zone and the horizontal abduction movement zone and the extension movement zone. So it gets really, really hard to try to define where flexion ends and where extension begins or abduction begins, so on and so forth, which I think it's okay that that's a difficult definition, because that's how movement occurs. Movement doesn't occur in these linear, what we've termed as linear ranges of motion. They occur in what we've termed as a movement zone. And so if we try to take that a bit further in the research, they've taken, again, the shoulder is the easiest thing to use as an example, but we've then said, well, ranges of motion are degrees of freedom. So therefore, because the shoulder has 6 ranges of motion, it must have 6 degrees of freedom. And so we've done a little digging on that, and that doesn't make any sense. So if we've defined that there can be these different angles of flexion and these different angles of extension and all these other movements of the shoulder, then there can't just be 1 degree of freedom in each direction either. Mm-hmm. And so if you kind of try to tease this out and you say, okay, well, what is a degree of freedom? A degree of freedom, and I won't do this justice because I don't remember the word for word definition, but I've looked this up. And so from a philosophical perspective, a degree of freedom, we have to consider the word freedom. And the freedom part comes from, or if you kind of take that means the ability to move freely without constraint. That's how we can sort of define freedom from a philosophical, like, if you want to get into free will, which we won't get into, but that's kind of what
we'll tackle that. We'll put it in a package, send it back to Sam Harris and tell him we figured it out.
Yeah. We can kind of say, well, that makes a lot of sense when you consider a degree of freedom and range of motion, the ability to move freely without constraint. If you then look at sort of a definition of what a degree of freedom might be from like a mechanical perspective, it's essentially a variable that a system can move into that allows for the ability to have freedom of motion. So, if you kind of take those definitions and you go, okay, well, that means then that range of motion can't just be one thing in each direction. If I want to have the freedom to move into flexion in a variety of different directions, which we've termed a movement zone, it's actually made up of, I don't know, thousands, millions, billions of individual degrees of freedom.
Let me give you this example. I want you to take this imaginary baseball. I'm handing it to you now. Play with me, grab it, thank you. Now, if you throw me the baseball, go ahead, Mike, throw me the baseball. So now I'm walking. Now, when I go to catch a baseball, nobody goes like this and catches the baseball.
Exactly.
Right? You're going to be wherever the baseball lands, you're going to be in a representation of shoulder flexion. But shoulder flexion isn't a thing. It's an opportunity to move into a zone, as we have termed it, or of potential. So flexion is I almost fell right off my chair. Could you imagine how that would have bumped up our viewership if I fell off my chair, smashed my face against the fucking thing, and then just put down, and then you're like, great.
And you were concussed?
And then you stand up and pretend that you can see over my desk because you don't understand the 2 dimensions of Zoom. Anyway, so it's an opportunity to move into a zone. It's like we say, it's a system. So there's variability is what we're getting at.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. So this gets a little bit more in depth, I think. So I think that helps us understand that range of motion and flexion, which we call the flexion degree of freedom, is not actually one degree of freedom. It's options of movement in the flexion, and that's how we can define a degree of freedom. It's the ability to have the ability to move there without constraint.
Okay.
And so I was super excited when I found this out. I remember telling you, but I was listening to Dan Dennett, who hey, listen, I don't profess to understand that motherfucker at all, but
It's so deep, man. It's so hard, but yeah.
I'm hoping that, growing this beard will help me understand him a little bit. But
Absolutely.
something really resonated with me, and I was on a plane actually to teach something when I was listening to this podcast with Dan Dennett. And Dan Dennett, he comes at things from a cognitive perspective. He comes at things from a free will and a philosophy of consciousness. And he was talking about degrees of freedom from a conscious perspective. And he said, think about a degree of freedom as solely an opportunity for the system to control itself. And I was like, holy shit, that makes a lot of sense.
Say that again.
That makes a lot of sense.
You might have cut out. Say that again, because I want to tease that out. So a degree of
So
ability.
Dan Dennett said, think of a degree of freedom as simply the system's opportunity to control itself. It's just an opportunity for control. That's what we've been talking about forever, is just, we want the system to learn about itself. We want the system to be able to control itself in any way that it should be able to learn and control about itself. So that's how we can think about a degree of freedom. And so then you come back to, biomechanics or mechanics, and you go, well, this definition of degrees of freedom that we're rationalizing range of motion on, it's just not jiving, because that means if flexion was simply one degree of freedom, then the system would only have that opportunity to control itself. And we know just by what we were just talking about that that's inherently wrong. It can't be that way. So if we look at the shoulder, which is the easiest, again, to demonstrate this, the shoulder is, gosh, I don't even know. Like if you define a degree of freedom as just an ability to move, there's billions of degrees of freedom in the shoulder. I mean, and I get it. Like the research in biomechanics has tried to take that really, really complex thing and break it down very, very simply. But so to say it's just one degree of freedom, but in our simple understanding, we've lost the understanding of why that is the way it is. And I think, when we look at range of motion, we don't look at it in traditional things of this is what range of motion is. We look at it in degrees of freedom. Like if you look at our cars, for example, cars are the expression of degrees of freedom that every joint should have. And so we can tease out those degrees of freedom that people are not exploring. And so now if we look at the definition of what that is, well, if you're not exploring that, like workspace, workspace is just the opportunity to express degrees of freedom, right? And so if we look at it and that workspace is small, or there's certain parts of that workspace that somebody's not moving into, well, let's take it back to the definition. That's not range of motion per se. That's, holy shit, you've lost the opportunity to learn about yourself, to control yourself in this part of your workspace that I otherwise think you should have, going back to what your system demand is, right?
Getting back to remember at the beginning of this, I was going to read you some quotes here. And
I want to keep going on that because there's a little bit more that I want to tease out.
No, but I just want to talk about this workspace one. So you define workspace as the maximum amount of strict articular motion that is able to be expressed.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
And so, I think that makes hopefully that makes a lot more sense now to people when we put it under the guise of, well, what does that actually mean? That actually means that you're made up of movement zones, not ranges of motion. And these movement zones are made up of fundamental things that we call degrees of freedom. And those degrees of freedom are how you learn to explore space.